So I want to think about decimals quickly, and I want to go back to talking about decimals on a number line. So when we're looking at decimals, we're looking at three basic place values. Remember, we're looking at the tenths, we're looking at the hundredths, and we're looking at the thousandths. So if I were to write a number, so for instance, this number, I know that the first place value here is the tenths. 4 is in the tenths place, the 7 is in the hundredths place, and the 5 is in the thousandths place. Now, we call each of those the name that we call them based upon how many of those pieces it takes to make a whole. So when we're looking at the tenths place, we know that it takes 10 pieces to make a whole. When we're looking at the hundredths place, we know it takes 100 pieces to make a whole. And when we're looking at the thousandths place, we know it takes 1,000 pieces to make a whole. Now, when I say a whole, remember, I'm just talking about one in this case, one whole. All right, so if it takes, for instance, 10 tenths to make a whole, and I asked how many tenths does it take to make half, that would just be half of 10, which would be 5 tenths. So 5 tenths would be the same thing as 1/2. In the same way, if 100 hundredths makes half, then 50 hundredths makes, if 100 hundredths makes a whole, then 50 hundredths makes half. And if 1,000 thousandths makes a whole, then 500 thousandths makes half. So we know that all of these numbers are halfway in between 0 and 1 whole because they are a half of a whole. Now, we can even mark on our number line halfway, which would be here, between a half and 0. In other words, what is it like to take a half and then to half that again, or a half of a half, or we could also call it a quarter. In order to take a quarter, I generally look at this middle number here and say, well, what is half of 50 hundredths? And that would be 25 hundredths. Or what is half of 500 thousandths? Would be 250 thousandths. And remember that those two things are the same. And in the same way, we could say, well, then if that's 1/4, what would be 3/4, halfway in between a half and a whole? And that would be like taking a half and then adding on a quarter. So it would be like 50 hundredths plus 25 hundredths, which is 75 hundredths, or 750 thousandths. Now, we can easily add unit fractions that we've talked about onto our number line as well. Now, just as a reminder, remember when we're talking about a unit fraction, we're talking about the top number here being our numerator, the bottom number here being our denominator. Remember, our denominator tells us how many pieces does it take in order to make one whole. How many pieces do we need in order to make one whole? And in a unit fraction, our numerator is always going to be a 1. But the numerator is telling us how many pieces do we have out of that. Now, this first number that I wrote here is 1/2. That is the fraction that would fit directly in the middle of our number line. Now, you may be thinking, well, is 1/2 the same thing as, for instance, this number here, 5 tenths? Yes. And if we wanted, we could also write that as a fraction as well. 1/2 is equal to 5 tenths. Those two things are exactly the same. Now, if I brought up, I'm going to bring up two more fractions. If I brought up the fraction 1/4, you will notice that the numerator is still a 1. It's still a unit fraction. And the denominator has now grown. The denominator has doubled. This means that it now takes 4 pieces to make a whole. It takes more pieces because 1/4 pieces are getting smaller. Remember, we said as our denominator gets bigger, the pieces are becoming smaller. Because the denominator is twice the size, that means these pieces are half as big. So 1/4 is the same thing as taking a half of a half, or a quarter, which would go here. So you'll notice that even though that denominator is bigger, those pieces are smaller, so we're putting it before 1/4 and saying that 1/4 is actually smaller than 1/2. Right? What about 1/8? 1/8, same idea. Notice we have that same one in the numerator. We have a unit fraction. And for our denominator, we have an 8. This tells me that there are 8 pieces in the denominator. It takes 8 pieces to make a whole, which is even double 4. That means it takes more pieces because our pieces are getting even smaller. So an eighth is actually half of a fourth. And we go here. As we're looking at unit fractions and my denominator gets smaller and smaller and smaller, we're getting pieces that are closer and closer and closer to 0. Now, we do have to think about what would happen if, for instance, I had a fraction that wasn't a unit fraction. So what if I had a fraction that looked like this, for example, 3/4? You'll notice here it takes 4 pieces to make a whole in my numerator, but I do not see a 1 here. Rather, I see a 3 here. That's because in this case, I don't just have 1 piece out of 4, but I have 3 pieces out of 4. Remember, it would take 2/4 or half of 4, 2/4 to make 1/2. So I know 3/4 is like a half plus an additional fourth. So 3/4 would be bigger than half, so I would fit it here. So when we're looking at unit fractions, we can focus mainly on the denominator. When we're looking at fractions that have a different number besides 1 in the numerator, we have to focus on the numerator and the denominator and compare that number to numbers like half to see if we can fit it onto a number line, to see how close it is to 1. So one suggestion I would make is that when you see a fraction, first look at the denominator, ask yourself how many pieces does it take to make a whole, then look at the numerator, how many of those pieces out of a whole do you have, and then start asking yourself, what would this be close to? Would it be close to a half? Would it be close to 0? Would it be close to 1 whole? And then you're going to have a much easier time when it comes to putting it onto a number line.